Hey everybody, hope you all having a fantastic week. As we go into our lesson today, we're going to be looking at the Ten Commandments. This is something that we've all know about. We've probably, those of us who've been in church our whole lives have probably heard about this. We've heard we've heard about this in children's church and everywhere you go, Sunday school lessons, all of that. We've heard about this probably many times in our lives. So as we're going to look at this once again. I want us to look at this and look at these try to look at this with new eyes, because a lot of times whenever we look at something that we've known time and time again, it gets to the point where it becomes old. It becomes something that we struggle with. So I want you to think of this and look at this through new eyes as we go through and look at this today. So to start off with, I want you to think of, and I'm going to put three pictures up here on here. The first one we have is a referee in football with a penalty flag at his feet. The next one that we have is a picture of a person that is wearing handcuffs behind their back. And the third one is a police car pulling someone over. So as we look and as we think about these three pictures, what is it that these three pictures have in common, if you think about it? What do these three pictures have in common? Someone broke a rule or a law and is paying the consequence for that. Right? And that's what happens. Penalties in football, people getting arrested, people getting speeding tickets, are all pretty common occurrences. You see that multiple times. In every football game, there's penalties. You don't go a game pretty much. I don't know if there's ever been a game where there's been no penalty flags that have been thrown in like the NFL or even in college or high school. There's probably always a penalty for one thing or another. You go down the road, it's hard to, like if you go down 85, you're always probably going to see someone pulled over by police officers. I remember not that long ago, a week or so ago, whenever I was going down to South Carolina, I saw police cars left and right pulling people over. It just all depends on when you go. And then people getting arrested, people are always getting arrested. I remember one time going down not that far from the church, and there was a lady who had 4 or 5 county sheriff's offices around her right down from the church when her car was getting searched. So these all have the same thing in common, is that they all get busted, right? These are all things that happen. And we think about some of the rules that you constantly break. Maybe, you break curfew, or, you're on your phone in class, or something like that. We all break rules all the time. Maybe you have your driver's license and you go over the speed limit a little bit. We've all been there. Or maybe you don't come to a full stop at a stop sign. I think that's something that most of us probably do. We don't come to a full stop at a stop sign if we have the opportunity to go. And so we all get into there. So are rules good or are rules bad? Well, rules can be good, but rules can also be bad depending on the rule, right? And then, do you like rules? I don't think any of us like rules. None of us like trying to be put into a box. It's like whenever we have these rules, we have to stick to this certain area, and we can't move. We don't like being put into this box. What is the point of rules? Well, the point of rules is to make sure that you do the right thing. You stay on the right path. You do what you're supposed to do, for whatever reason. And there's reasons behind many of the rules. Like some of the rules you have in class, you may not like them. Like you may like to have your phone all the time. And that's fine, but you can't be on your phone in class because you need to focus on your classwork. A lot of rules, there's reasons behind it. What do you think life would be like if there were no rules? Well, it would be utter chaos. We think that, it would be great, it would be awesome. But people would do whatever they wanted to. That's the way it goes. It would be like the Wild West almost approach, where there's very few rules, very few laws, and you just go do whatever you want to do. That we kind of see that in the Wild West movies. And so rules are important, and rules guide us and direct us to what we need to do. The Ten Commandments weren't just a random set of rules that God put in place for no reason. We're going to see that there's meaning and purpose behind them in our lesson today. While there are severe consequences for disobeying God, we're also going to see that God made a way for us to be a part of His family, even if we don't keep His law, even if we don't keep His law perfectly as we go through. So as we get into our lesson today, let's kind of connect the dots from our last lesson. Our last lesson we talked was about the Exodus and the Red Sea. So God rescued the Israelites from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. 400 years of slavery in Egypt. The people crossed the Red Sea and were free from the Egyptians. And they began to constantly complain about not having food or not having water. Because remember, they're in a desert area. They're not in a area where there's a lot of food and there's a lot of water. So they're complaining about that. And they keep complaining. And all the people looked to Moses, who was the leader. He led the people out, and he was God's appointed leader at this time for them. He led them out into there, and they were looking to him for food, for water, for what they needed to do. And they kept coming to him, and he was overwhelmed with this. Because you think about it, you have hundreds of thousands of people coming to one person. Moses was overwhelmed. We're not going to read this part, but if you want to go back and read it, it's in one of the previous chapters in Exodus. Between Exodus like 15, 16, 17, 18, right around in there. It talks about that Moses' father-in-law suggested that he create men who would hear these things. So he appointed men to help him lead, help him make these decisions so that he didn't have to make all these decisions. Because can you imagine the stress that would have added to Moses? Having to make all these decisions, having to guide the people, having to do all these things. And so now we're going to look and we're going to get into our passage and we're going to look closely at the Ten Commandments. Before they get there, let's set the stage for where we're at and what we're going to do here. So, and why God provided these, and the why behind the commandments is what we're going to look at. So we're going to look at Exodus chapter 19 to begin with. And we're going to read verses 1 to 6 of chapter 19. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain while Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possessions among all the people of the earth. All the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So here Moses is preparing to go up to the top of Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments from God. To receive the Ten Commandments from God. He's prepared to go up there. To be there, to commune with God in a way that no one else could, no one else would. And so, we think about this and we see this, and here we are, it's 3 months after. We know that because it's the third new moon. So once again, calendars were kept a little differently back then. We didn't have the dates like we have today where you have 31, 30, 30. They did it by the cycles of the moon. So pretty much in 4 weeks was a month in essence for them. And so the third new moon was the third month for them, that they'd come out. And so on that day, Moses went out. Why do you think that the nation of Israel needed to be reminded what was happening just a couple months ago, like 10 weeks ago? Why do you think that is? Well, the truth is that we're all forgetful people. We're all forgetful. We forget things. It's just part of our nature. It just happens. We get busy, we get going, and we forget things. We see God move in these powerful ways, and then it's like we go through these struggles in our lives. Like right after that, we see God move powerfully in one way, and then the next month we're struggling. Even though we saw God move in more powerful ways, in a way that was more amazing than what the situation we're dealing with. We're quick to forget about it. Before he established the Ten Commandments, God reminded them of how he had brought them out of Egypt, how he had rescued them and had the power to move them. He reminding them of the plagues and the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea. And all that God wanted to remind the people so that they would remember. Because it's so easy to forget. I always joke that, sometimes it's, we talk about remembering stuff, and I say, well, it's hard for me to remember what I had for breakfast this morning. And that was just 2 hours ago. So we forget things as humans, and that's why, because we need to be reminded of those things over and over again. God rescued the Israelites from Egypt to be a part of his people, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy people that were set apart from him, that were set apart to be different, And that's the thing, is that God wanted them to be different and set apart from all the other nations in the world. And so he provided them with these laws and the Ten Commandments. And he provided them with more laws later so that they would be separate. They would stand out in the world from all the other nations, to be a specific people who are God's people, who love him no matter what. And that's what we say. And God told them that all they had to do in order to be set apart was to keep his commandments and obey his voice and keep his covenant. And we're going to see that they didn't necessarily do that. And we're going to see this constant cycle here as we go through later on. But that's where we find ourselves now. So Moses is has left. He's up on top. And now Moses is receiving the 10 Commandments. Now we're going to scoot over to chapter 20, and we're going to read verses 1 to 8 to begin with. And we're going to look at the first couple of commandments here. And God spoke these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness or anything that is in heaven or above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children up to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, you or your sons or your daughters, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So here we have the first 4 commandments out of the 10. And these commandments all have one thing in common. So in other words, I'm just going to recap them. Don't have any other gods before me. Don't make any carved images. Don't make idols, right? Don't take the Lord's name in vain, and keep the Sabbath to keep it holy. So what is it that all these four commandments have in common? The thing they have is that they deal with our relationship to God. They deal with our relationship to God and how we should act towards God. Because people are bent towards sin and left to their own devices, we needed these commandments, right? And I can't remember if we're gonna look at this in the next lesson or not. But even like right after this, people were left to their own devices. They didn't know. Moses was up on the mount for a while. Aaron came in. They collected all the gold and built a golden calf to the people. So the people were left to their own devices, and they created this idol. Even Aaron, Moses' brother, the second in command, did this and led this and allowed this to happen. And so we see this, and so people left to their own devices do this. They will serve other gods, they'll take the Lord's name in vain, and disregard the Sabbath. Left to our own sin, God's commandment and lordship over our lives are things we naturally rebel against. And, so we see this time and time again. We see this in our society a lot, is that, people that aren't Christians, the Sunday is just another day for them. And unfortunately, that's actually kind of leaking into the church too. A lot of times, Sunday isn't as much focused on church as it should be. So we see that these 4 commandments deal with our relationship with God. Now let's look at the next 6 commandments and see what they deal with and what they have in common. So we're going to read Exodus chapter 20, verses 12 to 17. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. So we see here is that Moses receives the 10 Commandments from God, and we see the second set that comes in. Honor your mom and dad, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie about your neighbor, and don't covet your neighbor's stuff. Those are things that I think we deal with a lot, because it deals with our relationship. And these all have one thing in common, and that is it deals with our relationship with other human beings, with each other, or how we interact with others. When we think about God, we need these commands for the same reason, is that we need structure. We need this moral thing because we're bent towards sin. We're bent to do whatever we want to do. Right? We're bent towards selfishness and mistreating others, which happens so frequently in our society today that a lot of times we forget about loving others and we forget about these things. We see this, and it's like we see something that someone else has and we want it, and it's just and that creates this whole culture that we have to have the newest and awesomest and greatest stuff. I fall prey to that, right? I fall prey to wanting to do all these things. I'd love to have, a new house. I'd love to have the newest and greatest phone. I do actually now, but in my opinion, but we have these things, and we want these things because other people have them. And we covet our neighbor's stuff. We see what our neighbors have. Maybe they have a boat, or maybe they have a house at the beach, or maybe they have all these other things, but yet we covet it. And that's what it is. We want these things, and we lie, and we want to steal, and we want to take stuff, and we want to dishonor our parents, and all these things are innate. They're natural to us. So it deals with that. The Israelites just recently came out of slavery, and one of the things is that we got to remember is that the Egyptians worshiped many gods. The Egyptians had tons of gods. If you look at it, it's a fascinating study to look at the gods of the Egyptians. I mentioned it whenever we talked about the plagues last time, is that if you go and you look at the studies and you study, is that each of the plagues attacked one of the gods of the Egyptians, or multiple gods that the Egyptians worshipped. You look at it and you look at, I'm trying to think of, I can't remember what it's called. There's a movie out. It's interesting to watch, but it talks about the gods and how they are there, and all the different gods that they worship, and it's just they have so many gods, and yet we look back to chapter 19. God told them that they needed to obey Him and keep His covenant, and that was part of it, right? That this would change their impact of what they saw. They saw this, that they would be set apart. They wouldn't just have many gods like many of the nations do. And as they go in, and they went to the nation of Israel, as they went to the promised land, there was going to be times where they were going to deal with people who had multiple gods. They were going to deal with people who were doing things that were crazy. They were doing things that were different from what God told them to do. But yet they were to be set apart. They were to be different. And so that's what God wanted them to do. So obedience to the Lord would set them apart, because they wouldn't just take their neighbor's stuff. They wouldn't covet their neighbor's stuff. They would worship just one God. They would observe the Sabbath day, the day of rest. They would observe that. So other people would take notice of how God acts towards them, which is how we're supposed to be as Christians. We live in the world, but we're not supposed to be of the world. We live in the world, so we're supposed to be in the world, but we're supposed to be different. We're supposed to stand out for Christ. Whether it's praying for our food, reading our Bible, going to church, doing all these things, witnessing, telling others about Christ, instead of talking about the football game last night. All these things set us apart as Christians, and we need to try to do them, to try to follow through with them, so that we can be set apart and be different than the world. So people take notice. Did these people live up to the covenant? Did they obey the Lord constantly? No. There's this cycle of sin and disobedience and punishment, and then redemption. They'd repent, they'd be forgiven, all this stuff. And it was this cycle there. And so now we're going to look at how the story of the Ten Commandments is echoed it has echoes of the gospel in it. So we're going to go to Titus in the New Testament. So Titus chapter 2. And as we go here, we just said that the people of Israel didn't obey God perfectly. They didn't live up to the covenant. You know, we are not any different than the Israelites as Christians. We don't live up to God's covenant. We don't live up to God's laws. We disobey the Bible. We disobey what God says frequently. We all sin every day in some way, shape, or form. We do. You know, we don't live up to what God has called us to do. And that falls for me, that falls for any pastor out there. No one is perfect. No one does everything they're supposed to do. And let's say you decided to start fresh right now and just said, you know what, I'm not going to sin anymore. I'm not going to sin. I'm going to live a perfect life. Could you do it? The short answer is no. We can't do it. We can't live up to it because we are bent towards sin. We still have this, even though we're Christians and we've put on the robe of Christianity, this new robe, we're still bent towards sin. We still have that sinful nature underneath that comes to us and tempts us to do things that we shouldn't do. And we can never live up to God's holy standard for our lives. And so what should the consequence of this sin be? Well, the consequence for disobedience is death. Like Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." The cost of sin is death. It's death for us, eternal separation from God. You know, if you've already sinned, you don't have the capacity to stop you from sinning. It's pretty obvious that we can't live up to God's standard of the law. And that was part of what the law was. We read the 10 Commandments in there earlier, but yet there was more law that was given to Moses. You know, we go back and if you look at the rest of chapter 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, the next couple chapters even going talk about this. So now let's read Titus 2 verses 11 to 14. "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the glorious and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself to redeem us from all lawlessness, and to purify himself a people for his own possession, who are zealous for good works." So here in this passage, the ESV, which I read, uses lawlessness. That same word is translated in the NIV and some other translations as wickedness. You know, when we think about it, what does it mean when we're lawless? It's that we do whatever we want to do. There's no law. And how does that relate to what we're talking about? You know, God gave his perfect command, his perfect law and command for people to follow. We have disregarded that command. We do whatever we want to do. We follow our own inclinations to do this. We've disregarded God's law and have chosen our own way, and that's why we're lawless. We don't follow God's law. Even as Christians, it's hard for us to follow God's law because we have this lawless nature inside of us, this wickedness inside of us that causes us to choose to do wrong things. In verse 14, he also uses the word purify. He says that he will purify himself a people of his very own. Why do we need to be purified? Well, things that are dirty, things that are wicked, things that have sin in them need to be purified. It needs to be purified. God is holy and perfect. We've established the fact that we're sinners. We all know that. You know, Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." We all have missed the mark when it comes to that. We cannot do things in our own this. We're impure, and God demands that he cannot have an eternal relationship with us if we're with impurity. So we either suffer eternal separation for him, or we have to purify ourselves so that we can be part of his family and part of that relationship with him. And there's no way that we can purify it of ourselves. There's no way that we can be perfect by ourselves. There's no way that we can become this perfect thing. It's like whenever you deal with gold. You know, I don't know if you've ever watched this. Let me rephrase. Going back, I don't know if you ever watched the show Forged in Fire. Right. It is. I love the show. They make swords and knives and all these kind of cool kind of things. And it's just an awesome show. And they have these time limits and all these things. But whenever they do things, they have to whittle away. And there's these times where they get these impurities. And they have to figure out what to do. They have to fill it with weld. They have to try to make it perfect. In the same way as God does with us. God brought us salvation by offering us grace and redemption to us. He takes our impurities, he takes these little cracks that we may have in our lives, and he fills them so that we're perfect, so that we can be presented to him. And that's redeemed through Jesus Christ. You know, we can't earn salvation on our own. To earn salvation through our own is pointless endeavor. It's impossible, and it leaves us prideful about how good we are. You know, people who do good works, a lot of times they do this. You see these people who go out and do all these good things, but you see these people saying they're doing good things, but behind the scenes they're not good people. They may look good in life. They may look good like they're going out and being philanthropic. They're being generous with their money. They're spending their time helping people, but behind the scenes they're really not that people. You know, or you know, we're you can either have that where you get too prideful, or you get bitter and depressed because you've always failed. I don't know if you've ever done anything like that, but if you constantly are failing at something over and over and over, and you try, it can be depressing. It can be hard, and that's what can happen if we try to earn this through earn salvation through our own good works, through our own behavior, and our own obedience to the law. Because the purpose of the law wasn't to. One of the purposes of the law was to show people their need, that they needed a Savior. They needed that sacrifice, that no one could obtain this by themselves. And that's why the sacrificial system was created in the Bible, where they had to sacrifice an animal in the blood of a perfect animal, setting up who would be, when Jesus would come and be the perfect human being who would cover the sins for the whole world by his shedding of blood on the cross for us. And receiving salvation through God's grace takes the focus off us and puts it on God. You know, grace is something that we don't deserve. It's nothing that we can earn. It's something that's given freely. You know, it isn't a burden that we have to live up to with this when we look at the law. It's not a burden we have to live up to. And grace isn't a burden we have to live up to and say, have all these things like, oh, I got to do all these things so I can receive grace. No. Grace is a free gift that we receive. We're given it freely. You know, we don't have to pay anything for it. There's nothing we do. We can't earn it. We can't earn our salvation. But yet, we can have this relationship with God when we allow him to come into our lives and see it. So, as we kind of wrap up, you know, one of the age-old questions about grace is, if grace is true, if we're always forgiven for our sins, can we just live however we want to? You know, is disobedience really a big deal? If we could just sin as forgiveness and God covers the sin, can we live however we want to? You know, think about that for a second. You know, the answer really truly should be no. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Whenever we receive God's grace, we see the ability, we see that change in our lives. And it changes who we want to be and what are our desires and what we want to do. So we go back to our passage in Titus, and we look at chapter 12, verse 12 in chapter 2, and it calls us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, to leave those things behind, to no longer have those be a part of our lives, and live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. You know, verse 14 says we're supposed to be zealous for good works. We're supposed to seek out good works. You know, you look at grace 14, it sounds like grace means it doesn't matter how we act, if you think about it, right? But no, grace does not mean it doesn't matter how we act. It means that we can't earn our salvation. We aren't saved to be careless about how we live. We're saved to be set apart, to be sanctified in God's family. We talked about this last night on our Sunday night study. We talked about what it means to be sanctified. It's to be set apart. It's to be different. It's to be to point to things. So we're saved to be part of God's family and reflect him in the world around us. Grace frees us from trying to live up to the unattainable standards and frees us to live in God's light for us. Grace gives us that. Grace just allows us to be able to live the way that we should. And it allows for us that, we're still going to mess up. We still have this human nature. But that doesn't mean we go out and sin intentionally. Yeah, you're still going to be tempted to do things. You're still going to be tempted to all these things. But yet, for those times whenever you fall, grace allows you to get through those. And allows you for that relationship with God not to be harmed, but to be able to be healed. But that doesn't mean we go out and live how we want to Monday through Saturday and then come to church on Sunday and everything's fine. We still need to live godly lives every day of the week because we reflect Christ. We're a reflection of Christ. If people know we're Christians, they know that we're Christians. They should know that we're Christians. And if they don't know you're a Christian, if your classmates don't know you're a Christian, your people at work you work with don't know you're a Christian because of the way you live, then you need to start living like a Christian, to live differently, to live like you're set apart, like you're special, because you are special to God. You are God's precious possessions. So when we talk about it talks about being zealous for good works in there, and not to try to earn your salvation at the same time. Is it possible for us to be zealous for good works, to seek to do good things, and to try not to earn God's love and salvation? Yes. Yes, it is possible. We can be zealous for doing good, all while understanding that doing good doesn't earn our salvation. There are people out there who believe that the more you do, the better person you are. There are even Christians out there who believe that you have to do good works to be saved. You have to do these things. We should want as Christians to go out and do good things, to help people, to show God's love to others through reaching out to them, through witnessing to them, through talking to them, through meeting their needs, whether it's physical or spiritual, and meeting these, because that's what God did. God doesn't love us more because we do good works. Being zealous for good works doesn't mean that we're enamored by God's grace and love for us. Being zealous for good works means we're so enamored by God's grace and love for us that we want to obey His commandments and reflect His holiness wherever we go in this world around us that needs more than everything. So think about this as we go through and as we kind of wrap up. Let's just think about this for a second. We live in a world where people want to do whatever they want to. We live in a wicked, evil, sinful world that's getting worse and worse and worse. Think about, are you a Christian who's zealous for good works? Have you accepted Christ as your Savior so that you have the grace that only God can give? Are you zealous for good works? Are you aware of the consequences for your disobedience? Take a moment and think about these questions. If God's grace has granted us the ability to have this perfect, right relationship with Him that we could not do by ourselves. So as we go out this week, think about that and be zealous for good works as Christians, to go out there and do good works, but realize that by doing good works, it doesn't earn our salvation. It just reflects Christ to the world around us. Thank you so much for watching this lesson. I hope that you enjoyed. If you have any questions, reach out to me. My email is down in the description below. Thanks for watching. I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your week, and want to let you know that I am praying for each and every one of you every single day. So thank you, and have a great week.